The kettle was just starting to sing when I saw it. An email that made my hands go cold. $20,000 gone. My $20,000. Not for a medical emergency, not for fixing the roof, but for a luxury vacation my son booked without even asking. Just moments earlier, I'd been folding linens in the back room of the home my late husband built with his own hands 40 years ago, the afternoon light slanting across the oak table we once shared. In that quiet, familiar space, betrayal felt louder than any storm, and I knew the peace I'd guarded for decades had just been broken. But that morning had started like any other before I knew what was coming. It was one of those crisp, early spring afternoons when the sunlight slanted just right through the kitchen window, warming the oak table Jack built in 1982. I'd just finished folding the last set of fresh linens in the laundry room and was about to pour my second cup of Earl Grey when the phone rang. Ryan's name lit up the screen. His voice was full of energy as he launched into details about a trip to Newport, an oceanfront suite, fine dining, a helicopter tour. Each word polished and cheerful. I smiled where I thought I should, but something in his tone landed heavy like a shadow slipping into a sunlit room. "Hi, Mom." Ryan's voice spilled through the line, bright and brimming with that particular kind of energy he gets when he's about to tell me something big. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, smiling into the receiver. "You sound like you've got news." "Oh, I do. Guess where we're going next week?" His tone was almost boyish, the way it had been when he was younger and wanted to impress me. I leaned against the kitchen counter, cradling the phone between my ear and shoulder. Someplace warm, I'm guessing Newport. Ocean Crest Resort, right on the coast. Alicia found us this gorgeous ocean view suite. Balcony overlooking the water-heated floors in the bathroom, you name it. And get this Saturday, we're taking a helicopter tour over the shoreline. Then Sunday night, we've got a reservation at Seaview Dining and Wine. It's one of those places with the fancy wine pairings for every course. I could picture Alicia's touch in all of it. She's always had a taste for the high-end, the polished, the photogenic. Ryan went on, his words tumbling over each other as he described the spa, the private beach access, the robes embroidered with the resort's crest. "That does sound lovely," I said when there was a pause. "I remember going to Newport with your father when you were little. You screamed the whole drive down Highway 101 because you wanted to stop for ice cream." He laughed. "Yeah, I don't remember that part." "Where will Nathan be while you're gone?" I asked, thinking of my 8-year-old grandson with his shy smile and ever-present baseball cap. "With Alicia's parents in Corvallis. They love having him. Honestly, it's nice knowing we can get away for a bit, just the two of us. I mean, after the year we've had, we've earned it." There was that word, earned. It sat oddly in my ear the way a painting hangs just slightly crooked on the wall. I didn't ask what year he was referring to or how exactly they'd earned a helicopter ride and a 5-night suite. Instead, I let him keep talking, describing the towels, the wine list, the complimentary champagne on arrival. "Sounds like quite the celebration," I said. "Yeah, well, it's sort of our anniversary," he said, his tone shifting just slightly. "Alicia's been working so hard, and I landed that big project last month, so we thought, why not?" I knew the big project he meant. 2 weeks of freelance marketing work for a small local firm, the same firm that had been cutting hours for their regular employees. Ryan's version of the truth had a way of smoothing over the cracks. Still, I said nothing to contradict him. I asked about Nathan's latest baseball practice, whether he was still reading the mystery series I'd bought him for Christmas. We talked about the daffodils in my front yard just starting to push through the soil. He promised to send me photos from the trip. When we finally hung up, I stood there for a moment, the receiver still warm in my hand. The house felt quieter than before, as if something had shifted in the air. I looked out the window toward the old maple in the backyard, its branches swaying in the breeze. It had split slightly in last winter's storm, but hadn't fallen, just enough to be noticed. I made my tea, letting it steep longer than usual. The steam curled upward, disappearing into the stillness of the kitchen. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind wandering. but deep down a small knot had started to form, the kind you can't quite place, but know you'll have to untangle sooner or later. The next morning I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, sorting through the few emails I get these days. Mostly newsletters I forget to unsubscribe from and the occasional note from the local garden club. Then I saw it sitting bold and unread in my inbox: alert, unusual activity on your account. My stomach dipped before my mind even processed the words. I clicked it open, the light from the screen stark against the pale morning. The email was from my bank, not the spam kind, but the real thing. My account ending in 8427 and a line that made my pulse jump. A purchase over your set threshold has been made on your secondary card. That secondary card. The one I'd added Ryan 2 years ago when he'd been between jobs and swore it would only be for emergencies. A blown tire, a medical bill, something urgent. He'd even joked about never touching it unless he was on life support. I hadn't thought about that card in months. I logged into my account, my fingers tighter on the mouse than they needed to be. The page took longer than usual to load, or maybe I was just breathing too fast. Then the numbers popped up, crisp and undeniable. First line, Alaska Air. Portland to Eugene, 2 first-class tickets. $1,796.42. Second line, Ocean Crest Resort, Newport, Oregon. Ocean View Suite, 5 nights prepaid, $9,500 flat. Seaview Dining and Wine Sunday night, or $200 deposit for a prefix menu with wine pairings. Pacific Lux Rentals, luxury SUV, $1,820. Sky Vista Tours, private coastal helicopter flight, $1,500. Below those, a string of smaller charges: spa services, champagne delivery, valet parking. I scrolled down, my eyes scanning, but my brain already doing the math. $20,000. Not almost. Not around. Exactly. I sat back in my chair, my coffee cooling untouched beside me. The air in the kitchen felt different now, heavier somehow. My hands were cold, though the house was warm. There was no text, no voicemail, no casual, "Hey Mom, I need to borrow your card." Just a silent, deliberate sweep of what was mine for something I hadn't been invited into. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could hear Ryan's voice from yesterday. Bright, eager, talking about balconies and champagne flutes, layered over these numbers like 2 songs clashing. I wanted to believe there was some mistake, some misunderstanding. But the truth sat in black and white on my laptop screen, and it didn't apologize. I pushed my chair back and stood walking to the window over the sink. Outside, the lawn was still damp from last night's rain, the maple branches swaying. The sight usually steadied me. Not now. I thought about all the times I'd said yes to Ryan, without hesitation, without strings. When he'd needed rent covered in his 20s, when his car broke down 2 days before a job interview, when Nathan was born, and the hospital bill came before the insurance caught up. And now this. No ask, no explanation, just a withdrawal from trust like it was a bottomless account. I reached for the phone, then stopped. I knew if I called now, my voice would betray me. I'd hear his easy tone, his little deflections, and I might let it slide. I've done that before. I wasn't going to do it again, not without thinking. The kettle whistled, but I didn't move. My gaze stayed on the numbers in my head, each one a nail lining up in a row. I closed the laptop slowly, as though shutting it would make the facts less real. It didn't. I walked over to the corner cabinet in the kitchen, the one with the small brass key that sticks if you turn it too quickly. Inside, on the bottom shelf, sat a square metal tin that used to hold shortbread cookies. I hadn't kept cookies in it for years. It was my box for things I couldn't throw away. Not photographs or keepsakes, but records. Evidence. I set it on the table and eased the lid off. The faint smell of paper and dust rose up, the scent of years tucked away. There were envelopes, manila folders, and folded receipts in neat stacks bound with rubber bands. I slid one stack toward me and began to thumb through. There was the promissory note Ryan had scribbled on a yellow legal pad back in 2019 when his marketing startup was circling the drain. $15,000. I'll pay you back in 6 months, Mom. Promise. I traced the fading ink with my finger, remembering the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes when he handed me that piece of paper. Next was a hospital bill from Sacred Heart Medical Center in Springfield, dated the year Nathan was born. Alicia had called me, her voice high and urgent, explaining the insurance hadn't processed yet and they needed to pay something immediately to keep collections at bay. I'd written the check without hesitation. Another folder held a copy of a cashier's check for $400 to cover 2 months of Ryan's rent when he'd lost his job at a design firm. "Just until I get back on my feet," he'd said. I'd believed him. I didn't need to read more. I knew this pattern by heart, the ask, the urgency, my instinctive yes, and the quiet that followed. No repayment, no acknowledgement, no real change. I leaned back in my chair, the tin still open in front of me, and let the weight of it all settle. This wasn't about a vacation. It wasn't even about the $20,000. It was about the years of me filling in the gaps, smoothing over the cracks, making sure Ryan didn't fall too far. And somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing those acts as help and started seeing them as entitlement. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. Outside, a car rolled slowly down the street, tires hissing on the wet pavement. I closed the tin, slid it back into the cabinet, and locked the door. Bang. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I stood and filled the sink with warm water, dropping in a few plates from last night's dinner. The motion, the sound of the water helped me think. This wasn't going to be another chapter in that box. Another quiet bailout that I'd tuck away and try to forget. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a lawnmower started up, blending with the patter of rain against the kitchen window. I dried my hands, walked to the living room, and sat on the edge of the couch. The decision forming in my mind wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, shaped by every scrap of paper in that tin, and every time I'd said yes when I should have said no. I looked at the phone on the coffee table, but not to call Ryan. Not yet. This was going to take more than a conversation. This was going to take action. I carried my coffee into the small office off the kitchen, the one with the desk Jack built for me years ago. The morning light pooled across the blotter, catching on the edge of the old Rolodex I still kept. I flipped through the cards, fingers remembering exactly where to find what I needed. The Ocean Crest Resort was listed under O in my neat handwriting from a trip I'd taken there with a friend more than a decade ago. I dialed the number, pressing the receiver firmly to my ear. A cheerful voice answered, "Ocean Crest Reservations, this is Emily. I need to cancel a booking." I said, keeping my tone even. "Ocean View Suite, 5 nights, checking in this Saturday. Reservation should be under Ryan Collins, charged to a card ending in 8427. She asked me to confirm the last 4 digits again, then the billing address. I gave them without hesitation. "I'm afraid the reservation is non-refundable within 7 days of arrival," she said, the practiced sympathy in her voice almost convincing. "We can offer a credit toward a future stay." "No," I interrupted gently. "Cancel it outright. I'm not interested in a credit." There was a pause then, the quiet clacking of keys. "I can process that for you, but there will be a cancellation fee of $500. "That's fine," I said. And I meant it. When she confirmed the cancellation, I thanked her and hung up. Next was Pacific Lux Rentals. I found their number scribbled on a slip of paper from a year I'd helped my neighbor book a car for her daughter's wedding. A man with a clipped tone answered. "Reservation for a Cadillac Escalade pickup this Friday," I said, giving him the details. "I can downgrade the vehicle for you if you'd like to save on the cost." "I don't want any vehicle." "Cancel it." He explained the penalty. I agreed without flinching. One more line severed. Sky Vista Tours was next. A woman with a bright salesy tone answered, eager to tell me about their breathtaking coastal views. 2-person private flight Saturday morning, I confirmed. "Cancel it." "No reschedule." She hesitated, then assured me it was done. I could picture her confusion, wondering why anyone would toss away something so expensive. Finally, I called Seaview Dining and Wine. The maitre d' sounded almost offended when I gave him the reservation details. "That's a prime table," he said, as though I didn't understand what I was discarding. "I'm sure it is," I replied. "Cancel it." One by one, each indulgence fell away like leaves from a branch in a windstorm. There was no shouting, no speeches, just transaction numbers, confirmation emails landing in my inbox. When the last call ended, I opened my laptop again and logged into my bank account. I navigated to the authorized users section, found Ryan's name, and clicked Remove. A small box popped up. Are you sure? Yes. The button turned gray. His name vanished from the list, and the page refreshed, as if nothing had ever been there. I sat back, exhaling slowly. It wasn't triumph I felt, not the rush people talk about when they imagine revenge. It was something quieter, steadier, like setting a picture straight on the wall or aligning books on a shelf. A balance restored. The house was still save for the low hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the clouds were breaking apart in the pale blue sky. I closed my laptop, slid my chair in, and went to the stove. A pot of vegetable soup from yesterday sat on the back burner. I stirred it slowly, the scent of carrots and thyme rising in the warm air. In another life, maybe I would have been making extra to send home with Ryan. Not today. When the soup was heated through, I ladled some into a bowl and carried it to the kitchen table. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet. Every so often I'd hear the faint ping of my phone as another cancellation email arrived. I didn't rush to check them. I knew exactly what they would say. By the time I finished, the light in the room had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. I rinsed the bowl, set it in the drying rack, and stood for a moment at the sink, hands resting on the edge. The day ahead stretched quiet and open, but I knew this wasn't over. I dried my hands and glanced toward the cabinet where the metal tin sat locked away. Today had been about cutting the strings. Soon, I would decide what to do with the history inside that box. 2 days later, I was trimming the dead heads off my rose bushes when I heard the familiar creak of the side gate. Patricia Lane, my neighbor from 2 doors down, poked her head around holding a grocery bag in one hand. "Margaret, have you seen Facebook this morning?" she asked, her lips pressed into a tight line. I shook my head. "No, why?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Alicia posted something. Not flattering. Called you controlling, said you ruined their anniversary trip. She even put up a screenshot of some cancellation email. The comments are..." She trailed off, shaking her head. I wiped my gloves on my jeans. Let me guess. People agreeing with her? Patricia's eyes softened. A few of her friends, and she hesitated. Ryan, too. He chimed in saying you embarrassed the family. The words sat heavy in my chest, but they didn't surprise me. I thanked Patricia for telling me and walked her to the gate. When she left, I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, pulling my reading glasses from my pocket. I opened my laptop and logged into Facebook. I hadn't been on in weeks, maybe months. The post was easy to find. Alicia had tagged Ryan. There it was, a close-up photo of an email from Ocean Crest Resort, the cancellation notice. Above it, her caption read, "When your own mother can't let go of control, she'll destroy your plans just to remind you who's in charge." Below that, Ryan's comment. "Some people value control over family, and some..." Guess I learned the hard way. Friends of theirs had piled on. Snide remarks, sympathy for Alicia, even a few calling me petty or vindictive. People I'd met at their wedding, at Nathan's birthday parties, writing like they'd known my heart their whole lives. I closed the browser. The kitchen seemed colder than it had a moment ago. That afternoon, a knock came at the front door. When I opened it, a man in a windbreaker handed me a thick cream-colored envelope and asked for my signature. "From Harper and Dorsey Law," he said before stepping off the porch. I carried it to the table, slid it open with the letter opener Jack had given me one Christmas. Inside was a formal letter on heavy stock, the kind that made every word feel like it weighed more. It was from Ryan's attorney. He was suing me. Emotional distress, financial interference, breach of verbal agreement. He wanted damages, legal fees, and a court order reinstating his access to my credit line. I read it twice slowly. The legal jargon was dressed up, but the core of it was simple. He was putting into writing what he'd already said online. that I was the villain in his story. I sat back, letting the paper rest on the table. My fingers felt cool against the polished wood. There was a time this would have unraveled me, sent me scrambling to explain to fix. But that time had passed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 3. I rose, walked to the sink, and rinsed my hands under warm water, though they weren't dirty. Outside, the sky was the color of pewter, the air heavy with the scent of rain. I knew exactly where I needed to go next. I went straight to the cabinet and pulled out the small brass key that stuck if you didn't turn it just right. The lock gave with a soft click, and there was the metal tin again, sitting square and heavy on the bottom shelf. I carried it to the dining table and set it down, the weight of years in my hands. Lifting the lid, I started pulling out the contents in neat stacks. Manila envelopes labeled in my handwriting. Rent, tuition, medical, business, loan, each one thick with paper. I opened rent first, copies of cashier's checks dated and signed from the year Ryan's design firm folded, and he just needed a couple of months to catch up. Over $4,800 in total. Tuition. A paid invoice from the University of Oregon covering the last semester he couldn't finish paying for himself. $3,200. Medical bills from Sacred Heart Medical Center when Nathan was born, $5,600 after insurance, plus the pediatric dentist's receipt from when Nathan chipped a tooth at age 4, and Ryan's insurance hadn't kicked in yet. Business loan, the big one. The promissory note from 2019, $15,000 signed by Ryan in his hurried scrawl, never paid back. Next to it, bank transfer confirmations deposits straight into his account. And there were more. Wedding expenses I'd covered when Alicia's parents came up short. $700,000 for a used Subaru when Ryan's car finally gave out, even the $200 for his realtor's license renewal when he swore he was going to change careers for real this time. I did the math in my head, jotting figures on a legal pad as I went. $185,000. Not a cent returned. By the time I'd finished, the table was a map of our history. Years of me patching the holes in his life, all neatly documented. I reached for the phone on the credenza and dialed a number I knew by heart. David? It's Margaret Collins. I need to see you tomorrow morning. It's important. David Harper had been my attorney for 17 years, handling everything from Jack's estate to a neighbor's property dispute. His voice was steady as ever. 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock, I said. The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the streets slick and shining under a pale sun. I loaded the envelopes into a canvas tote and drove into town, parking in front of Harper and Associates. The receptionist smiled when she saw me. "He's expecting you, Mrs. Collins. Go right in." David stood when I entered, a tall man with silver hair and the kind of presence that made people lower their voices. We shook hands, and I set the tote on his desk. "I need to update my will," I said without preamble. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't ask why. Instead, he gestured for me to sit and slid a legal pad toward himself. "Tell me what you'd like to change." I began taking the documents out, laying them across the polished wood. "I want Ryan Collins removed as a beneficiary. Entirely. Everything. This house, my savings, my investments, will go to Ethan Moore." David's pen paused. "Ethan, your sister's grandson." "Yes. He's never asked me for a dime. Last winter, he drove 2 hours after a storm to shovel my driveway without being asked. When I gave him $20 for gas, he tried to hand half of it back." David nodded slowly. "And you're sure about this permanently?" I looked at the piles of paper between us. "Yes, I am." He adjusted his glasses and started writing, his pen moving in precise strokes. "We'll also want to update your power of attorney documents just in case." "Fine," I said. We went over the formalities, and he explained the witnesses required the notarization. It was all methodical, almost soothing in its structure. When I left the office, the tote felt lighter, though I knew the weight of what I'd done wasn't in the paper. It was in the finality of the choice. In the quiet drive home with the radio off and the road stretching ahead, I realized this was the first time in years I hadn't been carrying the question of what to do about Ryan. Now I knew. That afternoon, I was in the backyard deadheading the tulips when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I looked up to see a silver sedan pulling into my driveway. The door opened, and out stepped Thomas Reed, tall and broad-shouldered. His hair gone completely white since I'd last seen him at the courthouse retirement luncheon 5 years ago. Margaret, he called his voice warm but edged with something more serious. Patricia filled me in. I set my gardening shears on the patio table and met him halfway. I suppose she told you the whole mess enough to make me stop by, he said, following me into the kitchen. I put on a pot of coffee while he settled into the chair across from mine. His hands folded loosely on the table. I don't want to meddle, he began. But you've got yourself in the middle of a family lawsuit. And I've seen more than a few of those turn ugly. I poured the coffee and sat down. Ugly's already here. He nodded, taking a sip. Then let me give you some advice from someone who's presided over cases like this for decades. First, keep everything. Every receipt, every email, every scrap of paper. Don't assume you'll remember details. Write them down. Second, don't engage in public. No Facebook replies, no setting the record straight. That just muddies the water. I thought about Alicia's post, the comments Ryan's words under his own name. My fingers had itched to respond to defend myself. But I'd held back. So far I haven't said a thing I told him. Good, Thomas said. Silence unnerves people more than you think. It makes them fill in the blanks, and often they do a worse job for themselves than you ever could. He leaned back, his gaze steady. Years ago I had a case. Daughter suing her mother over a supposed loan. Mother never said a word outside of court. Just came in with her records, dates, and amounts. The daughter's own statements ended up contradicting themselves. Case dismissed. I listened, letting his words settle. So, you think I'm doing the right thing? I think you're playing the long game, he said. And in court, the long game usually wins. You've got the documentation. You've got legal counsel you trust. Let the process work. Outside, a soft rain had started again, tapping against the kitchen window. Thomas set down his empty cup. One more thing. Don't let this consume you. Go to your garden club meetings, keep your routines. If they think they've taken your peace, they've already won. I walked him to the door, the air cool and damp on the porch. As he stepped out, he put a hand on my shoulder. You're steadier than most people I know, Margaret. Don't lose that now. After he drove away, I stood on the porch for a moment, watching the rain streak down the railing. His words echoed in my mind. Not just the advice, but the calm certainty behind them. I closed the door, went to the cabinet, and ran my hand over the metal tin still tucked away inside. Everything I needed was already here. 2 weeks later, word started to make its way back to me. Not from Ryan, of course, but through the quiet network of small-town acquaintances who never quite keep things to themselves. A friend from the library mentioned she'd overheard a conversation at the coffee shop downtown. One of Ryan's biggest clients, a marketing firm out of Portland, had pulled a contract at the last minute. The reason, she said with a pointed look, was reputation concerns. It didn't surprise me that the story had traveled. Alicia's Facebook post was still up and people had been whispering. In a city the size of Eugene and with Ryan's business relying on image, it was only a matter of time before someone decided to steer clear. Later that week, I stopped into the hardware store to pick up some paintbrushes. As I was checking out, I heard my name in a low conversation between 2 men in line behind me. I didn't turn, but their words carried enough for me to catch family drama and lawsuit against his own mother. My cheeks stayed cool. I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing me react. From what I gathered, Ryan had been reaching out to new prospects in Salem and Bend, trying to replace the lost income. Each time he was turned down. One former client, a man I'd met briefly at a barbecue years ago, apparently told him straight out that he didn't want to get involved in someone else's mess. Alicia, from what Patricia relayed, wasn't taking it well. Without the Newport trip to post about, she'd shifted to subtler digs online. Cryptic quotes about betrayal and family, the kind that invite comments from friends eager to play detective. But offline, she was furious. Patricia said she'd overheard them at the grocery store arguing by the produce section. Alicia's voice was sharp, accusing Ryan of letting it all get out and making them both look bad. Money, too, had become a sticking point. Nathan's school tuition was due, and with the lost contract, they were scrambling. I could picture the conversations. Alicia pressing him about the bank loan they'd taken last year for home renovations, Ryan trying to explain away the dwindling client list, and beneath it all the isolation growing as their circle of friends shrank. Invitations stopped coming. People they'd dined with a month ago were suddenly too busy to meet. I didn't gloat. This wasn't about wanting him to fail in his work or his marriage. But I knew without having to hear it from his lips that Ryan was beginning to understand something I hadn't been able to make him see before actions have weight. Choices echo. One evening as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, I saw their SUV drive past slowly. Ryan was at the wheel. Alicia staring out the passenger window, her face turned away from him. They didn't see me behind the trellis of roses. The car rolled on toward town, and I found myself wondering if they'd said a word to each other the whole drive. By the end of that week, the whispers had quieted, but not because the story had died. It was because everyone who wanted to know already knew, and Ryan's world had shifted. The vacation was long gone, but its shadow lingered. In lost income, in strained conversations, in the kind of silence between two people that's harder to break than any shouting match. It was a gray Tuesday afternoon when I heard the crunch of tires on my driveway. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the front window, I saw Ryan's SUV speckled with road dust, parked too close to my flower bed. He climbed out without looking around, shoulders squared, jaw tight. I met him at the door before he could knock. "Ryan," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Mom, can we talk?" He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping past me into the hallway. He smelled faintly of coffee and the cologne he'd worn since his 20s. We sat in the living room, the space between us wide enough for a coffee table and years of unspoken things. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Look, this whole will thing. It's gone too far. I was angry you were angry. It got blown out of proportion." I folded my hands in my lap. Blown out of proportion. He avoided my eyes. "I'm saying we don't have to do this. Just change it back. Put things the way they were. Why I asked." His head came up sharply. "Because I'm your son. Because this is my family, my future. You're making a permanent decision over something that was temporary." I let the words settle, watching the muscle in his jaw tighten. "Temporary," I repeated quietly. $20,000 taken without a word, and years before that of what? Borrowing, forgetting to pay back. That's not temporary, Ryan. That's a pattern. He shifted back in his seat. It was one mistake. I was trying to give Alicia something special. We've been under a lot of stress, and you decided I should pay for it. My voice stayed level, but I could feel the steel beneath it. His expression hardened. "So you really want me to regret this for the rest of my life? Is that it?" I held his gaze. "You've already made sure of that yourself." For a moment, neither of us moved. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed louder in the quiet. His eyes flickered. Anger hurt something else I couldn't name. Before he stood abruptly. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. He headed for the door, pausing only to glance back as if searching for some sign I'd change my mind. I didn't give him one. The door closed behind him with a muted thud, and through the window I watched him walk to the SUV, shoulders stiff, not looking back again. I stayed where I was until the sound of his engine faded down the street. Then I exhaled slow and steady, the air cool in my lungs. By the end of that month, the next wave of consequences seemed to arrive all at once. Patricia mentioned it to me first in her careful way. Alicia had packed her things and taken Nathan to stay with her parents in Corvallis. Just for a while she'd supposedly told people, but the way Patricia described the scene, 2 cars loaded, Alicia's face set in that brittle determination. It didn't sound temporary. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Word travels fast in a place like this. Within days, it was common knowledge that Ryan was living alone in their house, the blinds in the front windows drawn most of the time. The business troubles that had started as whispers were now loud enough that even I couldn't avoid hearing them. The lost contract in Portland had been followed by 2 more cancellations. A couple of clients he'd counted on for years stopped returning his calls. I overheard someone at the farmer's market telling a friend that you just can't trust someone who'd take their own mother to court. Debt has a way of snowballing, and Ryan was standing in the path of the avalanche. Alicia had taken her income with her when she left, and without those clients, he was leaning hard on credit cards. Patricia told me she'd seen him at the bank, looking drawn. His shoulders slumped as he waited for a teller. His friends, at least the ones who'd rallied around Alicia's Facebook post, were quieter now. Some had unfollowed him altogether. The invitations to backyard barbecues and golf weekends had stopped. Even the men he played pickup basketball with on Thursdays seemed to have other plans. I tended my roses through all of it, pruning away the dead stems, coaxing new blooms. The work was grounding in a way that had nothing to do with revenge. It was my space, my time, something Ryan couldn't touch. On Saturdays, Ethan would stop by after his morning shift at the community clinic. He'd bring coffee and whatever pastry he'd grabbed from the bakery down the street, and we'd sit on the porch talking about his classes, his patients, the weather. He never asked about Ryan, and I never brought it up. That silence between us was its own kindness. Books, too, filled my days. Stacked on the end table in the living room, spilling onto the ottoman, I reread old favorites and let the words pull me somewhere far from here. Some afternoons I'd catch the scent of rain drifting in through the open window and think about how peaceful the house felt. I didn't avoid town, but I didn't linger either. There was no point giving anyone the chance to pass along messages I didn't want to hear. If people wanted to talk, they could do it out of my earshot. Still, I knew the talk was there. You can't erase a story once it's made its rounds. And maybe I didn't want to. Mama. Ryan's choices had written this one for himself, and now it lived in the same small-town air we both breathed. The morning it arrived was cool and bright, the kind of early autumn day when the air smells faintly of wood smoke. I was at the kitchen counter peeling apples for a pie when I noticed the envelope on the porch bench. No return address, just my name in handwriting I hadn't seen in months. I brought it inside, setting the apples aside. The paper felt heavier than it should, the ink smudged in small places where a hand had lingered too long. I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded 4 lined pages. Mom, it began. No apology right away, no long explanation. Instead, he wrote about the quiet in his house, the emptiness when Nathan wasn't there. He admitted he'd taken a job with a small printing company in Salem. Nothing glamorous, nothing like the contracts he used to brag about. But it was steady, and it let him keep up with the bills he was finally facing. He mentioned the debt in plain numbers. The credit cards, the car payment, the months of scraping by. He didn't ask for help. He didn't even hint. Instead, he told me how Nathan came over on weekends now, how they'd started building model airplanes together at the kitchen table, the kind of slow work that left room for talking. He didn't use the word sorry, but between the lines it was there, in the way he acknowledged the choices that had brought him here, in the way he admitted the lawsuit had done him more harm than good. I know you won't forget, he wrote in the last paragraph. And neither will I. I regret it. I read it twice, the words sitting differently the second time, less sharp, more tired. When I was done, I folded the pages along their creases and went to the cabinet in the dining room. The brass key turned easily this time. I set the letter into the metal tin alongside the promissory note, the receipts, the bills. A record of what had been, and now this. I closed the lid, locked it, and left the key in the drawer. Then I went back to the apples, the knife sliding cleanly through the fruit, the scent of cinnamon already in my mind. A week later, the roses in my front yard burst into full bloom, soft pink petals catching the early light. I brewed a pot of Darjeeling and carried the tray out to the porch, the wicker chairs still cool from the night air. The quiet was unbroken except for the distant hum of a tractor somewhere beyond the tree line. Not long after I saw Ethan walking up the drive, his jacket zipped halfway a wicker basket hooked over one arm. "Picked these this morning," he said, setting it down on the porch table. The apples were crisp and red, still beaded with dew. "They're beautiful," I told him, brushing one with my fingertips. "You spoil me," he grinned. "You've earned it." He took the chair opposite mine and I poured the tea steam curling in the cool air. We talked about his classes, the long clinical rotation he'd just finished at the community hospital, the elderly patient who'd insisted on calling him Doc even after he corrected her. There was no mention of Ryan, and there didn't need to be. The silence on that subject had become a kind of understanding between us. I knew Ethan kept his ear to the ground, and if there was something I truly needed to know, he'd tell me. We sipped our tea, the scent of roses drifting between us. From where I sat, I could see the edge of the vegetable patch, the rows of beans climbing higher than I'd expected this year. A sparrow landed on the porch railing, tilting its head at us before darting away. I realized sitting there that the heaviness I'd carried for so long was gone. Not replaced by joy exactly, but by a steadiness that felt more valuable. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about knowing I had drawn a line and kept it no matter the pushback. Ethan reached into the basket and handed me another apple. "You should make one of your pies with these." "I was planning to," I said. "Maybe this weekend." We lingered until the sun warmed the boards under our feet. Eventually, Ethan stood, promising to bring more from the next harvest. I watched him walk back down the drive, the basket swinging lightly in his hand. When he was gone, I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth soak into my skin. The roses shifted in a breeze, petals catching the light like thin paper. I thought about everything that had happened. The calls I'd made, the documents I'd laid out the door Ryan had walked through without looking back. Protecting what I had built hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. And if that protection made someone regret their choices, that was their burden to carry, not mine. If you were in my place, would you have done the same, or would you have chosen another path? I'd like to hear your thoughts.